Hey, I wanted to make a video for libertarians who are thinking of themselves as being politically libertarian and are trying to do libertarian things and are being uh, libertarians in a political sense where they want to change the world to be more libertarian. Now, I think this is an extremely flawed viewpoint, okay? I think it is a cop out to actually thinking about what you would like to see in the world. And I think a lot of people tell libertarians, like, when you're older, you're not going to be a libertarian anymore. But I thought it would be interesting if I made a video to explain why. Now, the thing about libertarianism is it says things that are, like, true, right? So it says that all human beings, want to maximize their individual utility, and they are the best ones equipped to make those choices and to produce things of value and trade it with each other, and all of that sort of stuff. And that's, of course, true. And libertarians say that the only thing that we need is, in order so that we don't live in a sort of tribal society with violence, is we need a state which can defend the state militarily. We need a fair and limited police force and judicial system. And then, depending on the type of libertarian, maybe some other minor services. But that's pretty much where libertarians want to end things. And of course, this is true, right? I think that every single person, every single ideology, what libertarians don't realize is every single ideology, unless they're just particularly maybe not very smart, agrees with this, okay? And anything that is not very important, they take a libertarian mindset in terms of finding the most pragmatic solution that everybody agrees to. I mean, this is like just common sense to do. And I think that libertarians, they sort of argue with people who maybe don't understand economics, or they don't understand, just maybe they're not very smart, to be honest, and they try and disagree with them about just basic facts about, like, oh, but this is important, but that is important. And the libertarian can always argue no, because what's most efficient is for individuals to make their own choices and to maximize their own utility, to start their own businesses, and to not have the big government, big brother watching over them all the time, trying to get them to do things that aren't in their own best interest. So this is all true, right? But the thing is, and what I hope I can bring you to, if you're a libertarian, is that this is not the end of the discussion. This is simply the beginning of the discussion, because of two major things. So first of all, what you have to understand about the economy is that it relies on energy, okay? If you were to make 1,000 chairs and you had 100 people, at some point there's a very diminishing return on how many chairs you can produce, okay? But if you had 100 people, you had 1,000 barrels of oil, there is almost no diminishing return on that oil, okay? Because energy is a very special thing. Energy creates its own demand and its own supply. Because, just as an example, if we just had way too much oil, right, we could just have lamps burning on the street so that it's really bright all night. Or we could have mining vehicles run 24/7, zero fuel cost. We could have factories just run. We could have 10 robots per person. We'd never have to delete anything. We'd have so many hard drives. Energy is very pivotal on a physical level to all of life. And energy is distinct from other goods and services in an economic context. There is almost no practical limit to energy. At some point there is, but energy is highly correlated to the production of every single other input. In fact, if you just go on a pure physics level, energy is the only input, okay? So energy, whether it be oil and gas, whether it be nuclear power, wind and solar, whatever it is, if it's energy, then it's very pivotal. And it's what the entire economy relies on. And you can really go into this in terms of how, if you think about it, the only major leaps forward in human history in terms of like how people actually live their lives have been dependent on how much energy there is. Like, how much changes have there actually been to the average person's life from like now versus 1950, because we had the same energy utilization around then. So if you asked some medieval peasant to distinguish us, they could distinguish us, but it would be very difficult. We both drive cars, we both fly airplanes, live in skyscrapers or the same type of houses. We wear broadly similar clothing, the same types of transit. It's the same, right? Even though we have the internet, we have things like that, it's actually very similar. And then if you go prior to 1950, which was when natural gas and oil really peaked in terms of like utilization, things were different. People wouldn't have had cars. There were no airplanes. It was just railroads, right? So that would have been the prior distinguisher. There would be no refrigerators. So a medieval peasant could definitely tell the difference between us, the 1950 person, and us in the modern day, versus that person with the railroad who's just relying on coal. And then you can go further back in terms of animal domestication, which increases the energy, and yada yada yada, back to the Paleolithic. Okay, so the reason I've brought all this up, I hope you can see, is that energy is not something which can be maximized with sort of individual utility. Energy is something which is foundational for the whole economic structure. It is not something which in of itself is optimized. The more energy there is, maybe on a sort of higher level it is optimized, but it is not up to the individual to optimize it, if that makes sense. It's up to the state. It's up to the state to optimize the energy production, consumption, and the growth of the energy supply, because it's just foundational. Everything else optimizes off of that, and it requires a lot of people to set up an oil refinery. It requires a lot of people to set up all these pumping stations. It's not something which can be individually maximized very effectively. I mean, it actually would be interesting if there wasn't a lot of regulation around it and people could just keep increasing the energy supply. But that's not the world we live in. I think that's an interesting thread. So this brings the question, right? Because energy is so important, because it is pivotal to every other economic good, and it is just the foundation for GDP per capita, for GDP, we require states to think about our energy supply. So the state cannot only just be a defensive force. It cannot only just be a basic law and order. It must also be necessarily there to safeguard and increase and set the energy supply, because this determines the level at which the rest of society is on. And in an ideal scenario, if the state was well run, it would seek to increase the energy supply and the energy abundance to the citizen. So that sort of breaks the libertarian ideas a little bit, because now it's not really up to the individual. It's not just basic law and order. Now it's also like there's a specific good that the government has to manage, has to increase, that is foundational for just the economy. Okay. Now, number two is this is the idea of group utility, which is that human beings are intensely tribal, culty creatures. If you think of where our societies came from, they literally came from these sorts of skull cults, human sacrifices, priest kings. This is the origin of our civilization. This has led to us today. And maybe people, want to ignore that fact, but it's just the truth. And the reality is that most people aren't out there trying to maximize their individual utility all of the time. In fact, around half the time, they're trying to maximize group utility. This is why people become suicide bombers. This is why people sacrifice their lives for their country, their loved ones, or raise a family, because it's not just about the individual utility. It's about the utility of the family. It's about the social standing. And social standing, you might try and argue that it has individual utility, but that's a bit of a cope. Actually, if people don't like you, it actually doesn't have as big of an impact on you as a lot of people who are very anxious think it does, So really, the sort of social utility there, the want to be liked, is an end to itself. So there's a strong concept of group utility. And if you open up a single history book, it's filled with different groups fighting each other for group utility, not individual utility. Now, of course, there's a bit of a bias there, the libertarian might argue, because who writes the history books, right? But see, I think that brings us into a strong point here, which is that because group utility is a thing, because groups do operate, in groups and for groups and by groups and optimize for group utility, it's not really correct to say that the state in of itself is an enemy, because if you have a sort of world where there's no state except the really basic libertarian one, and it's just a bunch of people sort of trading with each other, optimizing, there will still be these groups. And when a group becomes large enough, see, it can act with overwhelming strength, and it can crush these individualist libertarians, and it can dominate the entire state. It can become a tyranny. I mean, this is basically human history, right? I mean, imagine how happy these hunter-gatherers were living in this natural society, and then we got these sort of cult priest kings. We got the pyramids, and then now here we are, right? So that's just the reality of it, right? There's no need to be too sad. I mean, it is progress, right? We live in a very high-tech world, and we'll see where it goes. But that is to say that these large groups will prioritize group utility, and then will seek out to dominate the state, okay, to dominate the libertarian state. And libertarians acting individually are not able, they're impotent. They have no capability of destroying something which is united and strong. How many times in history have there been examples of a strong, organized, well-disciplined, trained, prepared group has crushed enemies that are 10 times their number just because of the disorganization of the masses, right? The disorganized mass, can never rule the organized minority. I think that's a good quote. I heard that somewhere. So, in essence, you're a libertarian, right? You think that we should optimize our individual utility and all this. Okay, and this is true. This is correct. I think anybody who's understands economics and is just like intellectually honest will agree with you. But I don't know why you've decided to stop here. I think you should interrogate why either you've believed this or you've been made to believe this, that this is where the thinking ends. Because it is not possible for a state to not, first of all, take energy into consideration, because it is the foundation for every other economic good, and it is the foundation for our wealth and the economy. So the state must take this into account. Otherwise, for example, I mean, what if there's one oil field in the country and one guy owns it and just decides, I'm just not going to sell to anybody, and then the state's entire economy crumbles and millions of people starve to death, right? This wouldn't happen if it was chairs, even if it was an individual farm, even if it was because you can have these vertical farms if someone buys up all the farmland. You can have this, you can have that. Every other good is replaceable, and the government does not really need to intervene. But in the case of energy, everyone would literally starve to death. There's no alternative if the source of energy is cut off, right? That's the foundation of modern society. We're addicted to the amount of energy that we have, because we have, per person, I think 30 to 50 times more than our ancestors who were hunter-gatherers. Okay, so there's the energy, and then once again, there's this group interest, which will always seek to gain power and control of the state. Okay, so in essence then, it is necessary to realize that libertarianism is a local action. It is something which is done for things that are not important. For things that are not important to the energy supply, which underlies the economy, for things that are not important to law and order, and aka managing these group interests, okay, then yes, you want it to be libertarian, right? But for things which touch on these two concepts, probably amongst others as well, it's not sufficient to be libertarian. That's just like you're closing your ears and la 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 la, I'm pretending it doesn't exist. But that's just not how the world works. And that's why there's no libertarian country. Okay, so then I wanted to get into this other thread here, which is that if it's not possible to be a libertarian because it's sort of a very incomplete idea, then what should you be, right? Now, I'm not going to make a video about what you should be, at least not this one, because I think that's up to you. That's up to your own individual interest. But with that said, I will say that politics is downstream of religion, okay? And when I say that, you might be thinking, oh, I'm an atheist libertarian. How is it possible that politics can be downstream of religion? Because it isn't for me. Okay, and when I say religion, what I really mean is transcendental meaning, okay? Religion is downstream of what is your source of meaning? What is your source of, the source of like how you base your actions, how you view the world, the lens at which you view everything from. Because if you look at human psychology, this is what determines your group interests, okay? So you should really seek as a libertarian to think, what is my source of meaning? What brings me meaning into the world? What do I want the future to look like? Because there are a lot of alternative futures, and I find that libertarianism is this sort of fake politics. I mean, I think most politics is fake politics, but libertarianism, it's like a stage show. It's like it's not meaningful. It's the absence of an idea, okay? Pretending to be an idea. Because true meaning is, what do you want the future to look like? That's really the question. Do you want the future to be like these tech bros, right? Do you want the future to be these sorts of AI assistants? You have your AI girlfriend, your AI husband, and they sort of drive you around in these nice cars. I mean, do you want a sort of matrix world where everybody lives in this sort of like pleasure vat for their whole life? Do you want do you want everyone to be farmers? Do you want everybody to be in like tribal sort of communities, villages, like closer together? Or do you want the nuclear family? Do you want to sort of everyone to live nice, affluent lives, going on vacations, on cruises? These are all different. Like realities, and you have to think of, what are your priorities? What is your source of transcendental meaning? So for a Christian, like a Catholic or something, there's these books about it, okay? And it's about it's about having a family. It's about being like humble. It's about loving everybody. That's sort of that source of meaning, and that's how they view how the world's going to be constructed. Now, that's just one example. There's many other examples. For instance, if you look at Dubai, that's a source of meaning about the world, which is in terms of how they view things. They have this sort of funny structure where Dubai is such an interesting place. They have all these foreigners who are doing their own thing, but they're still, I think, very Muslim there, and they're very close to that religious ideal of the Quran and all that, and they want to live in this world where they can be more pious to in terms of the Quran, but then other people can come and be free around them. I don't know. It's interesting. I should probably look more into that. But the point is, that's obviously, they have a different source of meaning than someone who's purely Catholic. And then if you even get away from just the Abrahamic faiths, there's also ideology, right? There's the communists who think that everybody should be equal and together in sort of the syndicalist sort of commune sort of structure. There's also people who, they view the world as like, maybe a test of strength or something, and they want everybody to go up and be stronger. There's a lot of different ideas about how you can view the world, and that is actually the true downstream source of politics, because what you base your worldview around, what you conceive of as good and what you conceive of as bad, and what you can even conceive of as being real or existing. For instance, I think I've talked about this before. If you don't believe the state exists, you act a very different way than if you believe the state exists and is good or is bad. It doesn't matter. So I would encourage you as a libertarian to consider, what is your source of meaning? What do you want the world to look like? I think I'm sort of drawn to this. You think, what do your ancestors want? Like, What have they been doing? What are you doing? I kind of think a little bit like, I like to think of it from an evolutionary sort of perspective. Maybe that's not for everybody, but you should really just consider these thoughts, because this is what allows you, allows you to form a cohesive political movement. This is what allows you to change the world, and this is what's real. This is what actually has an influence on the world. Because, just as an example, right? You could have this sort of village life in a sort of high-tech way, and you could have no robots except outside of the village or whatever, blah, 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 blah. And this would have basically the same individual utility as a world where it's more, maybe a little more like nuclear family. Everybody has their own AI assistant in their little house. These are very different worlds. These are very different conceptions, very different sources of meaning. But the same, for the individual, when your dopamine goes up, it must go down. Your cognition, you will very quickly adapt to anything. And from your perspective as an individual, your utility will be practically the same in most cases, right? So that whole thing about libertarianism, I just want to hammer in that that's for minor issues. Libertarianism is for how should we run the driver's license issuing, okay? Probably we should have some sort of privatized system with correct incentives, because it's not very important in the grand scheme of things, and it would run more efficiently done for individuals. But when you get into the deeper issues, when you get into what should be the constitution of a nation, should there be a constitution? Should everybody believe in the same religion? Should they believe in separate religions? Should the country look more like this? Should the country look more like that? These are the real issues, and it is groups that organize on these sort of transcendental meaning. It is groups that organize from this that have the power in the world, that have constructed the world that we live in. We come from these sort of but we come from these god kings who have made the world in their image, okay? Because they are the only people who are able to organize these groups around group interests to maximize group utility, that can organize their forces to control the supplies of energy, okay? That can act in an organized, consistent way through time to see their goals through. If you are just a libertarian and you're like, hey, well, I just want everyone to do whatever they want, blah, 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 I think everybody's a libertarian in that sense, right? That's kind of what everyone wants. If you strip away the transcendental meaning, and I guess that's fine, but then you shouldn't be a political person. You shouldn't even think about politics at all, because it is impossible for you to have any sort of impact, and it's just sort of like you're just sort of yelling at the clouds. So I hope that made sense. Just to sort of summarize here, I want to sort of open your mind to this idea of almost like, where do your thoughts come from? How do you perceive of the world? Not in this very like left versus right, not in this very constrained way where it's like, oh, I believe I like Tesla. Oh, I believe you should burn the Tesla. Like this sort of thing. That's not real. That's not a real source of meaning. That's not real. This is just the very top of a little wave, this little thing. This is nothing. This is nothing. This is not having any impact. What is having an impact, okay, is, I think what libertarians do get right is like, should we have a central bank? Should we not have a central bank? But then you need to go deeper, which is, why should a central bank exist or not exist? To what purpose? To what future should it exist? It should not just be for individual utility, because this is a lack of a meaning. This is not a meaning. It should be because we want X or because we want Y. But it is not sufficient to be a libertarian. So hope you liked that video. I hope that made sense. I've always wanted somebody to sort of make some sort of video or something like this, because I think people often tell libertarians like, oh, one day you'll grow up and you'll realize you shouldn't be a libertarian, but then they don't actually explain why. So I'm actually explaining to you why, in that it's actually a very incomplete doctrine that does not allow any sort of organization, that does not allow any, it's a very harmless thing. Nobody minds if you're a libertarian, because it's a harmless ideology. It do anything. It's toothless, it's meaningless, it's petty, and if all the aims of libertarianism were carried through, another God King would come by, and it would now be this sort of theocratic state. The libertarian state would collapse instantly because it lacks deeper meaning, which is what humans are built upon. Humans are not individual atoms. Humans are community focused. Humans care deeply about the supply of energy, okay, which is it's another huge thing. Humans are not these atomized things, okay? And if you think about it in that way, people want you to think about it in that way, because then you're just wasting your time. You're not being subversive. You're not being revolutionary. You're being a pawn, okay? So I wanted to just put that video out. I hope that converted some people, and I hope that gave you a deeper understanding of like the world.